And with Raphael, you have a very refined Renaissance artist, almost overly refined. The landscapes are more traditional in the effect of creating distance in the background. You still have the pyramidal composition, but you have a more opaque use of color. He also had a fair stylization of the face, but rounder than Da Vinci's and a little bit puffier or fatter. Slide. Then a completely different attitude, the Flemish painters to the Italians, where the Italians were much more emotional, the Flemings were much more practical. Just the climate dictated a different style of art. And with Jan Vaneyck, you have interior scenes, still religious, some portraiture, but he stayed indoors. Both the Vaneyck brothers, Hubert and Jan being the more famous, used oil as we use it today, mixing it with the pigment, and had some superb varnishes that have not yellowed over the years, so their paintings are still in very good condition. But you have the Flemish attitude of lack of anatomy. They were much more interested in what covered the figure than how the figure worked beneath the clothing. Slide. Another Flemish painter was Memling, M-E-M-L-I-N-G. Very much in the Flemish tradition of the lack of anatomy. He did a whole series of beautiful portraits, sort of sober, quiet, very serious looking people, most of the times in a prayerful attitude. But he enclosed the background, or included in the background, landscape. So you have a feeling of a much more open space and lighter, airier space in a Memling than you would have in a Van Eyck. He also did religious subject matter too. Slide. Then we have Bruegel, who was also a Flemish painter, that included in his landscapes were some sort of wild philosophical paintings of the horrors of war, peasant landscapes, the high horizon line, lots of activity in his painting, crowded with details. Slide. And Peter Paul Rubens, a later Flemish painter, not Dutch yet, but Flemish, much more sophisticated and developed style, but he had an exuberance. Everything was at its peak. His landscapes were the abundance of summer. Even his women had an abundance of form in their figures, full, rounded figures. His color had an exuberance to it. The brushwork is much more loose and emotional in the application. But you have a much later, like the 16th century person, that you want movement and activity in the canvases and the compositions. Slide, please. Clear the machine.
May I have your attention, please? This tape is on Rembrandt, Van Ryn, and Jan Vermeer, R-E-M-B-R-A-N-D-T, and V-E-R-M-E-E-R. Put in the first slide, please. We're going to look at the work of two Dutch artists today of contrasting values. Rembrandt Van Ryn is known as the master of light and shadow. Jan Vermeer is known as the master of diffused lighting. Rembrandt is one of the giants in the history of art, and Vermeer is one of the jewels, one of the lesser knowns, but one of the just as well liked. Rembrandt turned out a tremendous production of work during his lifetime. In Vermeer, there are only 37 known works during his lifetime. So the two artists contrast greatly, but both of the 17th century Dutch school. Rembrandt achieved a great success during his lifetime. Vermeer never achieved quite the notoriety that Rembrandt did. In an early painting by Rembrandt of the self-portrait of the artist, of which he did many during his lifetime, we see the already sort of stout, portly young gentleman facing the canvas. It is turned from us, the large, dark area sort of silhouetted against a light background, balancing with the figure of the artist, having moved away from the canvas, getting a look at the composition. And then the elliptical palette that's hung against the wall that sort of draws our eye to the background between the two contrasting elements of this painting. The colors are dark, warm, rich, fairly stark contrast between light and dark. A glow that floods the entire composition. Slide, please. Rembrandt's subject matter varied considerably, from portraits of the prosperous people of Amsterdam to the beggars that he found along the wharves and the docks, to religious subject matter, a theme that he returned to all during his lifetime. He did two versions of this one, the Supper at Emmaus. In this one, it's a little more classic in composition. The light floods the room. And later in his life, slide please, he rearranged the composition into a much more dramatic theme, with the figure of Christ being silhouetted against a blaring light in the background. Much more emotion in the man sharing the table with the Christ, all of a sudden realizing who his dinner companion was. And then the brilliant glow behind the silhouetted figure is repeated in the smaller glow of the figure of the woman back in the kitchen preparing the meal. Slide, please. When Rembrandt arrived in Amsterdam, his style was well accomplished by this time, and his first wealthy patron was the family of Jan Six, S-I-X, who commissioned many portraits of the family members that started Rembrandt on his career. Portrait painters were plentiful in Amsterdam at this time, something like 10,000 painters being registered in the Guild of St. Luke's, which not only included portrait painters, but also craftsmen, jewelers, architects, etc. Rembrandt rose head and shoulders above most of the crowd because of his sheer ability to catch a likeness. And this is what the Dutch wanted put down on canvas. The fairly wealthy society that they lived in, they wanted to record themselves and their possessions. In his early style, which carried through most of his life, with this sort of dark background with the face sort of spotlighted and the shadow side fading into the dark, rich tones, his technique was so confident that he could create ribbons of braid or buttons and with a few splashy strokes. He applied the light tones in thick impasto, building up a thickness over the surface of the canvas, and in the dark tones, keeping them more or less thin, washes, glazes, building up a richness of their depth. Slide, please. The first commission that really brought fame to Rembrandt was the anatomy lesson of Professor Tulp. In many of the organizations, they would contract these sort of set pieces of the different officers as they were installed each year to have a group portrait painted to hang in their guild halls. These were very popular things and looked at eagerly each year by the local people. In this one, although it was a great success, popularity-wise, it was not such a success artistically. Rembrandt was so contrived the composition in such a way as to present 8 equal portraits of the men, so that each would be as important as the other. Professor Tulp, even in pointing out some area on the cadaver, doesn't even seem the least bit interested in what he's saying or doing. He is sitting, having his portrait made. The others in the group are sort of jockeying for position, hardly aware of what's going on in the scene. It doesn't envelop or unify the whole group as one in a composition, but they're separately painted portraits. He realized this era, and later on in his lifetime, in another large group portrait, probably his most famous painting now, The Night Watch, rectified this mistake by making a masterful composition, but losing his popularity as a portrait painter by not emphasizing each individual member. And then a third portrait done toward the end of his career unifies both the traditional Dutch portrait method along with a unified composition, and we'll see these later on. Slide, please. Again and again, he returned to the religious subjects, the themes, the descent from the cross in these sort of dark, forbidding tones with the areas lighted to show you the center of interest. Slide, please. And after his downfall of the popularity of after the Night Watch, he turned to etchings for a 10-year period, doing beautiful dark in black and white tones of the etched plate, printing the things. His etchings now sell for about $40,000. Slide, please. But always the sort of grand scale in the religious subjects, the warm glows of the light, the golden tones, contrasted with the dark, rich browns. Slide, please. Slide, please. And Saskia, that came with a fairly rich dowry, and along with his own portrait commissions, they led a very wealthy life in the city of Amsterdam. She had a fine collection of jewelry, some large pearl earrings that you see in this early portrait, along with a very fancy house in Amsterdam and a collection of master paintings. After the fall of his popularity after the Night Watch painting, he finally did end up in bankruptcy, and after the death of Saskia, sort of lived a life of a recluse. Slide, please. The man in the golden helmet is a subject that he does over again several times. Caught by the gleam of the polished armor, he spotlights that with little thick globules of paint that seem to shimmer in their brightness, the head thrown in partial shadow, and then the shaded side fading away into the dark background. In a slide reproduction, this is sort of flattened out somewhat. But when you see an original Rembrandt, the colors shine, they glow, they gleam. And even in the darkest of shadows, there are still changes and nuances of tone. Slide, please. This tiny little painting is only about 5 by 7 inches and is owned by the Houston Museum. And it is a portrait of a beggar that he often used as a model. His studio was in a lower section of the city near the wharves and the docks. And he would use many times the beggars that would line the streets as models for his religious subjects. Slide, please. At the height of his fame, he was commissioned by a group of local civic guards to do their portrait for the local armory. There wasn't much room left on the walls for another group portrait, and there was one section that was selected that was in a fairly dark corner near the fireplace. Rembrandt, realizing that it would be very difficult to see this painting, decided on a composition of this sort of blast of a fiery furnace of light toward the center of the composition that would then combat and catch the gleam of the fire in the fireplace near it. He was commissioned by the group to include all the portraits and was sued after he completed the paintings for putting some of them in obscure positions, the back of some of them, not painting them in their regulation uniforms, but deciding on a more flowery uniform to add and enhance the composition, and also putting a very important light on the figure of the little girl in the left center that had absolutely nothing to do with the regiment whatsoever. There was a great fight and hassle about it. They were very disappointed in this portrait, even though it has become one of the world's greatest masterpieces, and this Rembrandt was fully aware of. Even to get it into the space in the Guild Hall, about 2 feet had to be cut off from either end of the painting, which accounts for the sort of crowded condition of the composition on either side. Slide, please. To give you an adulthood, one of them being his favorite son named Titus. He was quite shaken at the death of Saskia, and for several years his second companion, who was the housekeeper named Henri van Stoffels, whom he finally married in later life after the money from Saskia's will had played out. But there was a clause within the will that he would have lost the inheritance if he had remarried. Slide, please. This is a fairly late portrait commission, but done in an earlier costume style. The woman was quite elderly, and the ruff, or the white collar that encircles her neck, had long gone out of style and fashion. But she still wore it, and Rembrandt was sort of attracted to this white area that contrasted with the warmer skin tones. Slide, please. Slide, please. He tried landscape as much as most of the Dutch painters did, but was not very successful at it. The schemes gave him no central source to review, like the personality of a sitter. They were sort of dark, colorless things. Slide, please. That do not have the drama of the human content as his portraits do. Slide, please. Family group. Self-portrait of the artist. Slide, please. Just before you get to the room where the night watch is, you have a room in the Rijksmuseum. Just before you get to the room where the night watch is, you have a room in the Rijksmuseum filled with Rembrandts. Some of the very late portraits or self-portrait on the side wall, but dominating the room at the end of the end wall is one of the last group portraits that he did, which was the syndics of the Drapers Guild, or the officers in the Drapers Union. He achieved this commission through a friend of his. Slide, please. And combined in element not only the traditional Dutch portrait method, but unified the whole thing in composition. He's placed the men slightly above eye level, as if they were on a platform or a stage, and the jutting table sort of centers your eye in the middle portion of the composition. The book is opened, and what unifies all the men is that they're looking at the same spot in the room. Obviously, it's sort of a stop-action moment where someone in the audience has raised a question, maybe about the budget or about the minutes or something, as one man is sort of gesturing with his hand towards some figures in the book or toward the book. But it is a believable stopped action where the people are intently watching that makes you the one questioning these people. They're looking at you. So they are waiting for what you have to say, and in return, the whole thing unifies around you as the viewer. So even though they are very individual portraits, each spaced around, there's still a unified whole to this composition. Slide, please. Anything was subject matter for Rembrandt. Slide, please. This painting has become quite famous in the last few years when it was purchased in auction by the Metropolitan Museum in New York City for nearly $2.5 million. It's a large, important composition by Rembrandt, Aristotle contemplating the bust of Homer. It is in the nice, dark, warm, sort of golden glow effect. It'll be interesting to see what it is like after the Metropolitan cleans it or has it studied, because even as late as the 18th and 19th century, people varnished their Rembrandts with a yellow varnish to add to this sort of mysterious glow. Slide, please. I've saved the group of self-portraits for the last because Rembrandt is one of the few artists that has given us such a beautiful insight into his own life and personality through the many, about 50 or 60 self-portraits that he did. The first one being of a very early age, in the early 20s, about 20 or 21, of a very confident young man. Slide, please. And then we see him as a very wealthy. Slide, please. And as times get harder, the ups and downs of his private life change, so changes the face on the plump man. Slide, please. The aging process was fairly fast in Rembrandt. Slide, please. He lived to be only 63, yet he looked much older in his last portraits, a completely defeated man. The turban effect he wore because of the coldness in the studios. Slide, please. Slide, please. Slide, please. Slide, please. The second artist whose work we will see today is Jan Vermeer, V-E-R-M-E-E-R. The second artist whose work we will see today is Jan Vermeer, V-E-R-M-E-E-R. As I've mentioned, Vermeer is the master of the diffused lighting effect. His paintings are gem-like, jewel-like, precision, accurate. The perspective, so accurate in his drawings that you can decide what size the room is. The inventory of his furniture and furnishings and objects that he had within his household are portrayed so accurately you can almost make a list of what he owned. Most of his things are interior scenes. Not too much is known of Vermeer. He inherited a tavern from his father that was a combination tavern, inn, and art gallery. He carried works of other painters and had them in his collection and used them, as he did his collection of maps, within his own paintings. After his death, his wife sold most of the furnishings to pay off the debts, and then he went into obscurity for about 200 years, and it was not until the end of the 19th century that he was rediscovered. At that time, the list of paintings numbered about 140 that were attributed to Vermeer. And since that time, and especially in the 1920s, when an art historian named Gluck did great research on Vermeer's work, the field was narrowed down to the now present 37 authenticated Vermeers. The surfaces are like fine, polished patinas with beautiful, soft colors. The three main areas of his work were an early period religious subject, then the interior scenes, and then two exterior scenes, one from his window from his studio and one from the view of the city of Delft. He contrasted textures of the rug against the crisp linen. He contrasted shapes of hard-edged shapes against soft shapes. But always this beautiful presentation of the figure posing for him within an interior setting. Slide, please. We'll see some close-ups of this last painting. Slide, please. The shimmer that you see it in the slide transparency is almost as beautiful as in the original work. Slide, please. The Cook is an early work by Vermeer, and he uses a style that he employed only in a couple of paintings, and that was called pointillé. are points, little dots, little globules of paint in lighter tones, sort of giving a brilliance to the local tone area. Slide, please. As we see in the close-up, the tiny little dots of paint, he would paint the general color area, and then with a fairly juicy paint, drop these little droplets in lighter tones, building them up, that they actually give sort of a shimmering effect to the surface of the object. Slide, please. And then as we get closer to the loaf of bread, the whole surface is made up of these little drops of paint that almost take on a little bumpy three-dimensional texture. Slide, please. He did some paintings using the male figure that denoted his occupation, as in the architect, the astronomer, and the engineer. And in the upper right-hand corner, in the sort of dark area, we see how he signed his name, one of about 20 different ways as he signed the surface of his canvas. Slide, please. As I've said, Vermeer was obscure for many, many years, and his paintings were not considered of great value. So many of them were changed to suit the current times or the mode. In this one, the face of the girl has been completely repainted at a later date, and it's not all Vermeer's work. It is thought that the still life and the skirt handling in the front is of the original version. Slide, please. 3 little gems that he did of tiny size, about 6 by 8 inches, 2 of them in the National Gallery in Washington, and 1 of them in the Louvre in Paris, are close-up portraits, but it gives us an idea of a method that he used in painting. Vermeer used what was called the camera obscura, which is sort of like the photographer's ground lens, that he focuses the lens at the object or the scene, and then it is the image is shown on a ground glass plate. When you focus in on a certain area, the area beyond it or in front of it goes out of focus and becomes blurred. And he used this visual technique of blurring things to achieve the same thing in the head of the line in the foreground and part of the drape over the shoulder of the figure. We see this again, slide please, in a black and white photograph of the same painting. And then also in a black and white photograph of a setup of the chair and the drape, slide please. This is a real photograph that shows the object out of focus. The photograph was placed in focus right at the very top of the drapery. This was sharp. The rest of the foreground then being shown out of focus was exactly how he painted it. So he painted exactly what he saw. Slide, please. This is sort of a companion piece, approximately the same size. Slide, please. And one of the most beautiful paintings to me in all the world is the Lace Maker in the Louvre, 6 by 8.5 inches. Slide, please. The View of Death was also an early one that he employed the pointillist technique, mainly on the buildings across the river, giving them a sort of shimmering brilliance. And we'll see this technique as we move in closer into the details. Slide, please. Slide, please. Slide, please. And the people on the close bank. Slide, please. The other exterior view that he did was directly from the window of his studio. And if you move into the room far enough, you will see this exact scene framed by the window. Slide, please. He did 2 portraits of this young girl with a very dark background, both sort of in the looking over the shoulder technique, but with the pearl earrings and the blue and gold color scheme. Slide, please. This one was purchased some years ago for $350,000. If a true Vermeer came up in auction today, it would go for several million. Slide, please. Another favorite general subject matter was the interior room with musical instruments. Slide, please. His wife is model, the map in the background, the pale blue color scheme. This one also being in the Rijksmuseum. Very smooth surface to this painting. Slide, please. And probably one of his best known paintings, The Artist in the Studio. It's in the Vienna Museum, and it's a little bit larger in scale than most of them. It's sort of surprising. It must be about 36 inches tall. It possibly could be a self-portrait or just a view of the artist using his own studio and his own makeup as the model. Possibly his older daughter could be used as the model for the muse. He uses the device of the sort of drawn back drapery that lets you enter into the composition, and different artistic elements on the table scattered by the window that's behind the drapery. And here again you have another sort of magic stop moment where the artist lifts the brush from the canvas as he glances at the model to see what the next stroke will be. We have some details of this also. Slide, please. Slide, please. The drape that's used over and over again, contrasting with the yellow book. Slide, please. He can create this effect of shimmering light with these quick little globules of paint. At this point, it was not the pointillist technique as he did in the earlier ones, but just quick changes of tone, quick little brush strokes. Slide, please. And the map in the lower center of the painting. Slide, please. For our review, the first artist we studied this semester was Giotto, the first Florentine artist, and a forerunner to the Renaissance. Introduced humanism into his paintings. Rather than the stylization of the Byzantine period, he introduced an actual scene or a picture. He's still fairly flat, flat patterned halos behind the figure. Still some slight stylization to the face, but believable figures this time in believable situations, telling the story of Christianity. Slide. Masaccio understood anatomy much better, introduced a constant light source so that the light is always from one direction, which creates shadows on one side of the figures. Softened the background to create an atmosphere. His halos then were floating discs behind the head. Slide, please. Botticelli was much more of a classic of the Renaissance period. This was after much information with the study of antiquities, especially the Roman antiquities, which were based on the Greek. But even in Botticelli's work, there is a very elaborate quality to it. The drapery based on the wet drapery of the Hellenistic Greek sculpture, elaborate hairdos, a very fairly light color, opaque color palette. Slide, please. Leonardo da Vinci was also of the High Renaissance, did many portraits of religious things based on the late 15th century Renaissance idea of massive compositions with the one-point perspective that introduced infinity right on the canvas. Many of his subjects were in a pyramidal composition.
His portraits usually had fantasy backgrounds, sort of a rocky background that's showing no certain time or place behind the figure. Slide, please. And Michelangelo was the giant coming into more of the 16th century man, where the ideals were for much more movement in the composition. So his figures became more volatile, more active, stronger, muscled figures, both in his sculpture and his frescoes of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Slide, please. The epitome of the Renaissance, the refinement of the Renaissance, was Raphael, and he based his much the same on as Da Vinci did with the pyramidal composition. He used a higher color scheme, a more opaque palette, not the transparent tones that Da Vinci did, but Raphael epitomized the high Renaissance man. Slide, please. Then we looked at the early Flemish painters, jumping back a little bit in time, but the first one was Jan van Eyck. Now with Van Eyck, as with all the Flemish painters, they were not so much interested in anatomy as they were interested in portraying surface detail, the wrinkles, the feeling of fur, the feeling of cloth.